block. And now all these young people.
The only thing that actually needs the lake protection is that. Yes.
And I'm gonna keep an eye on that. You know, I feel like it's gonna be, I'm gonna put a please no flash sign in there too.
Yeah, is there a fire stop?
It's nice to
But since we only pass through like the past and it came down it, but if I start to see it, like I'm not worried about you're just keep protection on the part for me.
We're very happy that you all showed up, and we hope to make this event special for you. The Southwest Seattle Historical Society acknowledges that our Log House Museum is on Duwamish land. And so before I say too much more, I'd like to hand the floor over to Cecile Hansen, Chairwoman of the Duwamish Tribal Council, and our honored guest tonight.
My goodness, I'm honored to be here amongst all you honored guests and represent the Duwamish, the indigenous people of Seattle. I just want you to know that they give up a little, they gave some land up. But I'm telling you now, I'm very happy. We own 2/3 of an acre over there in West Marginal Way at the Duwamish Cultural Center. Anyway, I'm glad to be here, and was I supposed to say something else that you want me to say?
Oh, no, just whatever you want to say.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. I was telling, I was dropping names here. I knew Arlene Wade, and all the people that got this going, and they created this log house. And it seems to me that it seemed to be bigger than the time I was over many, 30, 40 years ago, and it seems like it's tiny.
It's pretty tiny.
You need to expand. Anyway, I'm happy that you're all here to look at the history and what this is all about, and I'm glad that we are in alliance with you folks, because we are the first people. Well, this is my second event. I was over this morning at the Duwamish River Festival over in South Park, and lots of people over there, and I did an opening, and then our canoe came in, and I had somebody else do the greeting though, but it was very nice, and I thought, my goodness, it's probably many times I've been in, but I forgot to tell the people at that time that a barge came up the river and stopped at the park, and it was leaders from our city who dedicated that park to the Duwamish Tribe, and I thought to myself, well, why don't they just give it to us? Don't dedicate it. But anyway, I was happy they did. I don't know, I don't see any paperwork about it, but I thought to myself, after they dedicated and they got back in the barge and I don't know where they went, I said, well, how come they didn't give us a piece of paper? Because I said, we could build our headquarters there. But you know, we've always been welcome to go back there again and to be involved and I have to say that when our canoe came, there's a lot of mud they had to walk through. Oh my gosh, I felt sorry for the canoe people. But anyway, when you have time, please come over to the culture. I know you. Anyway, come on over to the cultural center and join us sometime. All of you, you're all invited, and hopefully, if I'm not in my office, the girls will say hello and take your money. Oh no, just kidding. But you know, there's a lot of history that you guys can see and observe, and because a lot of people come from all over the world, and they say, well, or even West Seattle, and they say, we didn't know you was there, and I said, where do you live? And they said, West Seattle. I said, shame on you. Yeah. And because they didn't with the longhouse, I guess they go by there and they don't know that it's a longhouse. Yeah. But the chief is standing there watching y'all. So anyway, nice seeing you again.
Good to see you, Cecile.
Anyway, thank you all.
Thank you.
What are the hours that the log house is open?
Oh, I'm glad you asked, my dear. When are we open?
We're
I already know.
Tuesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. till 5 p.m.
And lots of people come there to join us, and do their tours and do tours and all that good stuff, and we're very happy. Although now I must announce, since I got the floor, we were having our major gala down at the waterfront. The man that owns the wheel, he's Chinook native, and he said, why don't you have your gala at our place? So it's gonna, check your calendar, because it's gonna be down there at the big wheel. I don't know what pier that is, but if you know where the wheel is, that's where our gala is gonna be. It's gonna be a daytime deal, so. And I hear that parking might be, but I know once they get that other part, there'll be a lot of parking. When they knock that other part down, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, then come to the gala.
What's the date of the gala?
I don't know. No, it's in October.
Yeah,
I
it's
think,
October 11th.
yeah, that's the one. Thank you, dear.
Yeah.
This is Katie. She works for us.
Well, and when we get the date, we can post it on our social media too.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Of course, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it.
Well, I hope that you guys will come over and see us. And I'm glad that I was invited to come and join you for a few minutes, so I applaud all of you and honor your presence today. Thank you.
So this exhibit is really a group effort, and I'll introduce our two guest curators in a minute here, but I do want to recognize the rest of our team. So if you haven't met me, my name is Tasia. I'm the curator here. We also have Rachel Regeline, who is our registrar and collections manager. We have Sarah Miller, who is our operations coordinator, and helped a lot with marketing and proofreading everything. We also have Melody Smith, who is our intern. She's currently a graduate student in the UW museology program. And she's not present here tonight, but we had a graphic designer. Her name is Corey Comrie, and she did a beautiful job making the maps and the intro panel. So I just want to thank everyone who was involved with this exhibit. So without further ado, I want to introduce Phil Hoffman and Greg Lange, our two guest curators, to talk a little bit about their research project and why they decided to talk about the 1907 annexation of West Seattle.
Oh, a notation.
Oh, yeah. We can talk about, so in opening this exhibit, we also decided to put a permanent sign up in our gallery, which acknowledges formally that our Log House Museum is on Duwamish land. Our historical society has a long history of standing in solidarity with the Duwamish and recognizing their struggle for recognition. And so we feel like this is a thing we can do to acknowledge the Duwamish and the first people here. So, yeah.
Do you want to read it?
Sure, yeah. So it reads, the Southwest Seattle Historical Society acknowledges that the Log House Museum is on the traditional lands of the Duwamish people. The museum is built from logs predating Seattle's first colonial settlers. We honor with gratitude these traditional lands and its stewards. And I have to give credit to Ken Workman over here for that. He helped us draft this, and it's really beautifully written, so definitely want to thank you as well. All right, Phil, Greg.
I guess I'm supposed to say something.
Yeah, if you just, so maybe just give an overview of, why you wanted to research this topic.
Okay. Well, I will, but I want to say something about this exhibit here at the gallery today. There are two elements in the exhibition which were not included in the research papers that underlie the exhibition here today. And they take care of a glowing omission and really enhance the exhibit that we do have today. And the first is a telling of the first people's governance of this area of the Duwamish Peninsula, which is the topic of the annexation between the lines. The second one is a discussion about, at the time in which the annexation issues took place between 1902 and 1907, who could vote? And that was a very narrow slice of people, people like me. If anybody other than me wanted to vote, good luck, because you had no right to vote. Which brings me to the underlying topic of why I got interested in this issue of annexation, the creation of local government on the Duwamish Peninsula. The efforts actually predate the city of West Seattle. They begin on February the 15th, 1890, with the founding of the West Seattle School District. But the story of being about of expansion of that school district, the creation of the city of West Seattle, the proposed creation of the city of Alki Point, the proposed creation of the city of Alki Rainier, which stretched all the way to the center line at Rainier Beach of Lake Washington. Can you imagine a city like that? From Alki Point to the center line of Lake Washington was a story of decision-making and elections, which were canceled or ignored by judges who were, I believe at least, were highly influenced by economic power. There were 2 elections that were scheduled that were canceled by a judge's judicial injunction. One time, 24 hours before the election was to be held, the second time, 48 hours before the election was to be held. And they enjoined the holding of those elections on the basis of the election would bring harm to the plaintiffs. The notion of an election being harmful was, quite frankly, very emotionally disturbing to me, which got me deeply involved into the story. The third instance was where there was an annexation election held, which unofficially the vote count was 17 to 12, in other words, it carried. The judge acquiesced to a settlement between the city of West Seattle and the plaintiffs, in that case the Puget Mill Company, to not canvass and officially count the vote. In other words, the ballot box was to be ignored, effectively saying, we held the election, but we don't like the results, therefore we'll dismiss the election's result. Now, it's one thing to complain about an election's fairness, processes, who could vote, if people voted who couldn't vote, whatever the case happens to be. But here we're dealing with the issue of the sheer magnitude of an election being ignored or being dismissed or canceled at the last minute. In this current political world, I could see people, quite frankly, trying to repeat history. I hope that history, that part of this story of a community trying to improve itself, a community trying to grow, a community trying to prosper, is not ignored, and that we remain vigilant about our right to vote. The right to vote has 2 aspects of it. The first one being the election itself. The second one being, as Tasia reminded me very well when she talked about, Phil, we got to put this in here. Who could vote? It's, every vote should count, and every person should be able to vote. So, that was what powered me through this research program. But we're also telling us another story about the growth, development, a community seeking to prosper, which is just as important as the notion of democracy in elections. Let me turn it over to Greg, because if it wasn't for Greg, this exhibit would not exist here today. Because Greg is the King County archivist. And the reason I fell into this stuff myself was because he rendered up unto me, Caesar, a giant volume about this big this way, and about this big this way, and about this big this way. an index to the records of the King County Board of Commissioners, where I was looking up liquor license information, and because I was writing a land use paper. I was going to liquor licenses, mitigation of bad behavior, you know, we're going to isolate them. And Greg hands me this, and I open it, and I start looking through it, and I said, Greg, what is this? City of Alcott Point. What is this? City of Alcott Rainier. So if it hadn't been for Greg, this exhibit would not exist. Let me turn it over to Greg. Greg has some things I'm sure he would like to say about the city of Seattle and the role they played in the city of West Seattle expanding throughout the Duwamish Peninsula. There were 7 attempts to do that over a period of 3 years and joining the city of Seattle. Let me turn it over to Greg.
Thank you.
And then I guess question, something?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just say just a few words here. In regards to me being integral to this whole exhibit, I'm really good at pointing people in a direction and letting them do the work. For me to say, Phil, here, then I can stand back and let Phil do all the work on it. But it's fun to try to find connections between what people are interested in, researching, and where those sources are and where he might be able to get some answers. Before I say something about the dynamics of the annexation, I just wanted to briefly mention the First People. And you mentioned the Canoes and the coming of the Canoes that was going on just recently. Back in the 1850s, when all the Euro-Americans came in and put down stakes in the ground, basically during most of the 1850s, the predominant way of getting around Puget Sound was by canoes. And almost all of the canoes, the propulsion system of the canoes were the Native Americans. They were always hired, they were hired with their canoe, and they would transport people all over. Steamships came in early. They always kept on breaking down or sinking or doing other things, and you can almost get where you wanted to go. There were hardly any trails here to get around. The main area, the main way you went around Puget Sound is to get into a canoe and go from one point to the other. And when a wind came or darkness came, you just pull into shore and make camp for the night and then move on the next day. Also during that period of time, people, Native Americans were coming from all over to Puget Sound. The Haida up on, and Indian tribes from the Queen Charlotte Islands would come in canoes, and they would be large enough for 50 to 75 people, natives. That's how large they were, and that's how many people they could carry. 75 might be a little bit high, but it's 50 to 60 people, I think. And they would come in, do work. Sometimes they would get into disputes with the natives down here, and they would pick up slaves and do that sort of thing, but their main thing was to do work. During those very first years of the settlement here on the point, the sounds that you would hear would be the songs of the natives when they were rowing, when they were paddling around Puget Sound. They always had a song when they were paddling. The other sound you would hear would be the crashing of trees, because that's basically was the main employment. Down here, people would be cutting down trees and hauling them, sending them down to San Francisco. So those are the two kind of sounds that you'd be hearing, an occasional steamship coming by. Anyway, that was just an aside. The Native Americans bringing the canoes back, I think, I'm really grateful that that's happening, because that's a very powerful thing. Annexation. What fascinates me about annexation is kind of the dynamics that are going on between what the locals want in the area that's being annexed and what the city of Seattle wanted. And at certain points along this 7-year period, like Phil was saying, there was almost an average of 1 annexation attempt a year during that period of Part of it was for the locals to kind of control what happened in this area. And part of it was the city of Seattle, they wanted to be the biggest and the best and the largest in the Pacific Northwest. They were fighting it out with Portland and to be the most dominant city and being able to pull in all the resources from the entire Pacific Northwest. And so they were trying to figure out every way they could to kind of do this one-upmanship with the city of Portland. The city of Portland had a Lewis and Clark Expedition in 1904. The city of Seattle came right back with the Alaska Yukon Pacific Expedition in 1909. And so there was all this dynamics, and the city, the census was coming up, right? When we were getting close to 1907, there was a census, and they wanted to be the largest town in the Pacific Northwest, and so they could use that as a calling card. And so the city was just wanting to grow big and get bigger and bigger. Whereas the people here, they were more concerned about, as Phil alluded to, where the liquor saloons are going to be. What kind of control do they have over their ordinances? Are they going to, since nobody's going to build a streetcar line to go up the hill of Duwamish Head to the top of the hill, they wanted to form a city, the city of West Seattle, so they could have a trolley line, because nobody else wanted to do it. So, gosh darn it, we're going to make a city and create our own transit line, so we don't have to climb up that hill during a rainy day after the boat. There's a boat that came in from downtown Seattle out to Duwamish Head, and then they would have to trudge up the hill to get to the top to go to their home, and they got sick and tired of that. So, so that was part of it that was going on. The other thing that you've always got to think about during this first decade of the 1900s is how quickly things were changing. You think things are changing, in Ballard over the last 15 years and around Seattle. It went, the population of the city of Seattle went from 80,000 in 1900 to 240,000 in 1910. A tripling. Now, part of that was the annexations, but really the number of people in each of the annexations areas weren't really that large. But what it did provide is areas for the city to expand into, and so when you just think about the infrastructure and building the sidewalks and the regrades that were going on in downtown Seattle, I mean, it was just an upheaval of change, and of course, obviously ignoring the environment, could care less about what the environment was, as long as they could infill everything south of Pioneer Square and make it into an industrial area. Just do that infill of all the tide flats out there. So I find it really interesting, that first decade, because of how enormous the changes were and how the city was adapting to that. Just one final thing about the competition between Seattle and Portland. When this area was finally annexed in 1907, there were some other areas in South Seattle that were annexed, and the city of Ballard was annexed in 1907. That kind of was it for, till the early 50s, when the area between 85th and 145th was annexed. So they kept on growing and growing, and then they realized, oh my God, what are we going to do now? There's all this stuff that we got to do with all this empty land and do the infrastructure. Whereas the city of Portland, they kept on annexing, and they did it in smaller bites, right? We did a big chunk here in Seattle, and so everything kind of stayed the same for a long time. Down in Portland, if you look at the Portland annexation map, you can see the city growing little by little as the decades passed. So it was kind of interesting to see what the comparison was between here and the city of Seattle. I didn't have anything official to say here. If anyone has any questions, or with Phil or I, we'll be happy to answer them.
I have one, Greg. I was up in North Seattle the other day. I don't get up there very often, and I was amazed how densely populated it seems to be compared to the South, and Alki being so old. Seattle and South seems to be a lot less densely populated. Do you know why that is?
So what area specifically are you?
We're up around Ballard and north of there up to 100th, northwest. It just seems like everything north of the city is more dense.
Yeah, well, I mean, my sense, when you look at the size of the lots, you know, so if you're in Wallingford and in parts of West Seattle here, the lot size is pretty small.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at single-family residences, there's, you know, in that area, it's pretty dense. The further out you got, people wanted, you know, to, you know, not in my backyard kind of situation, so that the lot sizes became larger and larger as, you know, as time went on. You got into the 30s, 40s, and 50s. The zoning that Phil was talking about, and maybe eventually you might get into zoning. You know, the areas, at least in North Seattle, seems to get larger now. The other thing that was happening is, you know, during World War II, all these people were coming in to work at Boeing, and so they had to build a lot of apartment houses and things like that were going on. So as far as the density goes, there was some vacant land up there, so you could buy some land and put up an apartment house, you know, without a lot of cost. So if that's what you're referring to, that probably the main dynamics for that was what was going on during World War II and the explosion of population and trying to satisfy that need for housing for those people.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
What year did the West Seattle Ferry?
This is the gentleman that's going to answer that question. Phil. What year did the West Seattle Ferry?
Years.
Okay, I'm going to have to give you estimated dates because I did not prepare for this question. But somewhere around 1893, the West Seattle Ferry began to run, and it ran on Canoes.
The maiden run was December 24th it was Christmas Eve of 1886, or I'm sorry, 1888.
Oh.
And then the West Seattle Ferry was added in 1907.
What was the 1886?
The City of Seattle Ferry.
That was the name of the boat.
And then they added a second ferry called the West Seattle in 1907.
Right, and the ferry ran until 1915, something along that
In the
line.
20s. Yeah.
In the 20s, and at that time it was actually operated by King County, if my memory is correct, and they finally threw up the economic surrender flag. It was discontinued. The reason it was discontinued.
The bridges were coming in.
Yeah,
That was a big
in 1902, the Spokane Avenue bridge viaduct across the Elliott Bay Tide Flats was opened in September of 1902, and the street railway across the Tide Flats up to what was called Illinois Avenue around Duwamish Head, where the old Luna Park used to be, opened in 1907, and a year later the street railway was extended to Orleans and Beach Drive, and other streetcar lines were extended up to the junction and whatnot, so that killed off the ferry. And
So who built the West Seattle train line?
okay,
And
that gets into the annexation story. Let me.
yeah, okay.
In 1902, a fellow by the name of Jacob Firth, who was president of the Seattle Electric Company, received a franchise to build the street railway from Seattle across the Tide Flats, up the side of the hill, into what we know to be the Admiral District today. He failed to perform, and the city of West Seattle City Council revoked his franchise in 1904, I believe it is. Subsequent to that, the city of West Seattle decided it was going to be the first in the nation to get into the municipally owned and operated municipal streetcar line business. And they opened up a streetcar line that ran from the West Seattle Ferry Terminal, which is where the Marination is today, up California Place, up to California Avenue, and towards what is the intersection of Admiral Way and California. It ran up and down California. And they operated that at a loss of $12 a day. Now $12 is a lot of money back then. And they wanted to get out of the street railway business like you wouldn't believe. And one of the motivations behind the annexation was to extend the area of the city of West Seattle so that they could extend the length of the street railway car and secure more patronage. They could not serve an area outside the city of West Seattle. So that's why one of their motivations for annexation was to develop additional patronage to reduce their $12 a day loss. Jacob Firth, actually, in his pictures over here on the wall, opposed the annexation because he wanted his street railway back, plus he wanted a grant of an electric utility franchise, because he was the president, after all, of the Seattle Electric Company, a subsidiary of the Stone and Webster Public Utility Holding Company out of Boston, Massachusetts. I love to do that because that means but anyhow, in part to relieve his opposition to annexation and to get out of this economic burden they had, they gave Jacob Firth an electric street railway franchise. And Firth, at this time, acted upon his franchise and built an extension of his street railway down First Avenue to the Spokane Bridge, across the Spokane Bridge to Spokane and about Arizona, I believe it was, up what we call Harbor Avenue today, around the Duwamish Head and down Alki Avenue to Orleans and Beach Drive, plus some other lines in the years immediately following that. So that's the long answer to the Jacob Firth and the Seattle Electric Company built the street railway. And by the way, part of the story of annexation is how the city of West Seattle ultimately screwed Jacob Firth, because they drug their feet on the issuance of a franchise for the electric utility. And they wrote on the closing hours and the closing minutes of the City of West Seattle City Council minutes, we have held open the opportunity for a municipally owned and operated electric plant in West Seattle. And we now call it the Seattle City Light.
Yeah, Firth was given like he had 1 year to put in a trolley line.
Right.
That it? Yeah, so he had to do it within that year. He was so busy dealing with downtown Seattle area and the Seattle, because he was everywhere. And so he just kind of ignored this out here. And so when the year came up, he didn't get an extension. He was he wasn't very happy.
Okay.
I think I heard you say 1902, Firth and electric coming across the Spokane trestles. Can you describe 1894 and 1893, the burning down of the last longhouse, which is right at the base over there? Did you, in your research, did you run across any of that connection?
I have been researching this question, and to the best of my knowledge, Jacob Firth had absolutely nothing to do with the Herring House. I'm in process of looking into this. Greg actually helped me out not too long ago by locating a map that gave the precise location of the Herring House, which is very important because it tells me who owned the land upon which the Herring House sat. And because there's a motivation there. The Herring House sat unmolested from the late 1850s until 1893. Why? Because the original owner, European American owner, actually died in the late 1850s. He was a donation land claim recipient. And his heirs wanted nothing to do with him because he abandoned them back east and came out here. Now, to get to the issue, I don't know if people understand what Ken's talking about. In 1893, there was the Duwamish main village on the eastern shore of the Duwamish River was burned. It was torched. It was an act of arson. It was reported in the Seattle newspaper at that time, the morning after, and nothing was done.
It was fairly large, too.
Yes, oh yeah, this was the center of the Duwamish cultural and economic life.
You said eastern shore. Did you mean
Well,
western?
yeah, I'm sorry, Western Shore. On the Eastern Shore in downtown Seattle, what we call Pioneer Square, there was another center of Duwamish culture, economic activity, and social life.
But this is to western shore.
Yeah, this is the Western Shore. I'm sorry about what would be today at the junction of Alaska Avenue and the shoreline of the Duwamish River in its original form, an original meandering form around Alaska and whatnot.
Were people living there, Phil, at the time? It was.
Oh, yes,
it was
yes, these
actively-
people,
So it was torched when people were away, were people hurt?
I'm absolutely certain, news reports of the day, which I have access to, are very sketchy. But I could not imagine people not losing their lives. I could not imagine people not losing their life's accumulation of possessions. I could not imagine people not losing all the emotional items that you and I would have, and I'm certain that they had, if my house was burned down for some reason or another. I just couldn't imagine that. So, what I'm trying to say here is this was all part of the growth of the Duwamish Peninsula. I have a historical theory, which needs to be proven, that the Union Pacific Railroad and the Southern Pacific Railroad were in a conspiracy with the Great Northern Railroad to build a railroad route along the Puget Sound shoreline across Alki, across the Duwamish Head, to about where we have the West Seattle Ferry, or had the West Seattle Ferry. And the Southern Pacific Railroad was building, well, it was plotting to build a line from Portland, Oregon, along inland to the western side of the Duwamish River to join the Union Pacific just south of the Duwamish Head and head out across the Elliott Bay. And on what was already built by the West Seattle Land and Improvement Company, the Seattle Terminal and Elevator Railroad. The Herring House was in the way. One fact, which is a certainty, is that there was a fellow who was the general manager of the West Seattle Land and Improvement Company, which was an indirect subsidiary of the Southern Pacific Railroad, by the name of John F. Watson. Now, the Native Americans who got quoted in the newspaper on the morning after the arson said that the only thing that they knew is that a person that they knew by the name of Watson was there. These are facts that I have, but I have not been able to tie them together. I have only hypotheses.
Another question.
Okay.
Do you happen to know when the land that Herring House was on was titled to this person that owned it? And you said somebody owned it. That
Yes.
wasn't Duwamish. Do you have
Yes.
the exact date when that happened?
Yes. I have, with utilizing the records at the King County Archives, I have developed a chain of title that goes from this donation land claimant, his name was Hebner, H-E-E-B-N-E-R, to the person who purchased it from his descendants, a fellow by the name of Rochester.
Whose descendants?
Hebner's descendants.
Hebner's descendants,
And,
okay.
He purchased the rights to the donation land claim. And
is there a date on the donation land claim? 1849, 1848,
I'm guessing it's probably the 1860s.
Arthur Denny was the land agent.
So that would have been 1861.
Yeah, okay. Yep. So.
I have no further questions.
But there is a chain of title that leads to a fellow by the name of Charles A. Sinclair, an official of the Boston and Maine Railroad. His offices were maintained in Boston. He died in 1899, I believe, and his father-in-law was the president of the Boston and Maine Railroad. He was a member of the board of directors of the Boston and Maine Railroad. And one connection I have not been able to make is between Charles A. Sinclair and the Union Pacific Railroad, but I do know that the officers and the stockholders, the chief stockholders of the Union Pacific Railroad by the name of the Ames brothers, lived in Boston, Massachusetts. I cannot imagine two railroad investors not talking to one another, but I don't know if they ever did. It's my problem.
You had a question?
I did, and perhaps it's up here, I didn't have a chance to read everything, but why did the annexation start once it was moving in the direction of West Seattle in big chunks? Why did it stop before it got to White Center, which is still, you know, unincorporated?
You're talking about the southern boundary?
Yeah, the southern boundary.
Well, first of all, you got to understand, as Greg discussed, that the Duwamish Peninsula was effectively outside the city of West Seattle and Alki. And even Alki, there was just a handful of people, a couple hundred people. And in Spring Hill Village, just down along the shoreline, there was just a couple hundred people. It was largely wild, as the plaintiffs would say, wild and unimproved, hilly, and difficult to navigate. So they were, every time they would deal with an area of annexation that was much larger than the city of West Seattle that moved south, they were actually taking in a lot of empty land. The border you talked about more often than not was Roxbury Avenue. What we know is Roxbury Street today. It was an arbitrary and capricious decision to move to Roxbury. All Roxbury was in those days was a line on the map of the public land survey system that marked one township to the north and another township to the south, and all that meant that another township started 6 miles north of that, and another township started 6 miles south of that. It was just...
So just to give you just a very brief overview, you know, the homesteaders, they would come in and before, except for the very, very first settlers that came in, Denny and Boren and Terry and a few of the early settlers, basically before you could homestead, you had to wait for the US government to survey the land. And they did it in a system that was section, township, and range. They actually, there's a place that you can go down to on the Willamette River in Oregon where that was the starting point, right? Just arbitrarily, they stuck a stake in the ground and said, that's where we're starting. Then, as Phil was mentioning, they would just start surveying townships. And what a township is an area that's 6 miles by 6 miles, right? That's just the arbitrary area that they picked. And then they just kept on extending those surveys. And then within that 6 mile by 6 mile area, there are 36 sections, 36 square miles. You know, each section is 1 square mile. And so then they did that survey, and it just so happens that one, I think it's a township that's Roxbury, is that right? It's the edge of a township. Yeah. It just so happens that arbitrarily, one of those 6 by 6 townships, bang, ends up right along Roxbury. And so when they were looking at a map, it was really easy to just pick the edge of a township of that 6 by 6 mile area to establish that line. So there, and in part they looked at what was, you know, how development was, but that's basically how they did it. So all these straight lines that, I mean, it's just, when you think about a general land office surveyor going in, what they did was they had to survey the land, and they had to go up hills, down hills. This was all old growth. So they had to climb over trees, fallen trees that were 5, 8 feet in diameter, and lay out these lines. And so they had 3 people on the survey crews. They had the land surveyor, they had the chain man who carried basically the tape. That was called a chain because it was literally a chain, and that was the measuring tool that they used. And then the last and probably most important person was the axe man. So to just chop through those straight lines when you're going up hills and down gullies and, you know, out to the edges of lakes and things like that. So So that was kind of the basic organization of that. And then once they got those surveys, then the homesteaders could come in and choose their 160 acres that they wanted, or if they were married, 320 acres.
Thank you.
Sure.
The question has an important implication for today, because in all this annexation that took place, generally there was this line at Roxbury that was drawn east to west to the river from Puget Sound. Sometimes, but there was the city or the town of South Park, which got in the way of this line that was drawn east-west. And they couldn't annex, per se, the city of South Park. So there were some areas on the eastern side of South Park which were not annexed by anybody. They were outside the city of the town of South Park, and this line couldn't be drawn to take them in. In one occasion, and the proposal for the city of Alki Rainier, they created they went south of the city or the town of South Park, and they created a little strip 435 yards wide south of the city or town of South Park that went straight towards Lake Washington, which would have annexed a good portion of the area south of South Park today, as well as what's called the sliver by the river. There's a little area, no more than, in one place, 10 feet wide, that is unincorporated, lies outside any city that is east of South Park and west of the river. If you can believe this, it's there. We have it drawn in a little small red thing just above Marty's head. So some of this capriciousness, some of this just stuff that happened, we live with today. And some people like it that way, some people don't like it, but they have their right to an election sometime, and I hope no judge cancels it.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Okay, great. Well, we'll be around to answer any questions that you might have if you think of them. I just want to thank all of you again, not only for attending this event, but for being members. By being a member, it means that you're buying into our mission and also supporting us to put on programming like this, do exhibits. So we really thank all of you. So please feel free to grab more drinks and snacks outside, look at the exhibit, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening.
Did you have something about the street names that you were going to share with
us? Phil has that.
And real quick before you get into that, Tasia, do you have any upcoming events you want to mention?
Oh, yes. So on August 31st, we're going to have our third iteration of Cycle History. This tour focuses on community gathering places in Delridge. So I think...
it's a bike ride.
Yeah, it's a bike ride. We should clarify that. We do it in partnership with West Seattle Bike Connections. So we have a bunch of speakers. We'll be stopping at a bunch of community gathering places. It's family friendly, not a very strenuous bike ride, so we hope you can all attend that as well. And you can find more information on that on our website. And Kathy?
And then our major fundraiser is on Saturday, November 2nd, our Champagne Gala Brunch, which should be celebrating music in West Seattle. I think the history of music groups coming to West Seattle, I think it should be really interesting. So that'll be at Salty's on November 2nd.
All right. Well, thank you all.
Let's see, not too many people know about this paper. Okay, I got the connection now. I'm being asked about a paper that I'm working on, I'm going to be releasing shortly. It's called What's in a Name? And it's a history of the naming of streets in Alki. And Alki streets have had many of them have had more than one name. And some of them have only had one name, like 64th Avenue Southwest. And then some of them also had one name like Alki Avenue, which, as I report in the newspaper, in the article, is named after a failed commercial enterprise of Charles L. Terry called the town of Alki. It doesn't take its name from, it takes its name from this failed town, which takes its name, it was given to it as a, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a word, it'll come to me, but it's a word that means by and by.
Oh, Alki.
Alki.
New York
Alki.
Alki.
Alki, as it was pronounced until the 30s.
Yeah.
So, so is there something that you wanted to ask about this paper?
Oh, I just wondered if you're gonna, I was under the impression maybe there's gonna be a piece of paper that said what each of these streets used to be named, or what the history
We're
is.
still figuring out
Still
what
working
that,
that out.
that's gonna develop.
That's beyond my pay
He's
grade.
doing all the research first. We like to build projects around the research, so they've got a lot of depth.
Yeah, the plat where we live, which is up on Land Room 37th, I have the plat of that. It's Walker's second plat or something like that. And it actually has on the drawing the original street names crossed out and the new street names printed in.
Oh, that would be
that area of town.
Make sure the museum gets this.
Oh.
Because that would be a very interesting article.
It's not an original, it's a photocopy, but.
Oh, I mean, photocopies are also useful for research,
Okay,
so.
okay, well, I could do that.
Right, but finding out who made those annotations is a real find.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, but those are things that are in Grandma's attic that need to be put in a good safe.
Well, the area, I think that, I'm assuming the plat was done, it has somebody's name on it, but I assume it was done by West Seattle Land and Improvement Company, because the Hainsworths lived on one block, and he was the head of it, and then the house we're in, the guy was vice president of.
Is that Arthur Stretch?
Arthur
Stretch?
No, this was in 1916, and his name was Dana Brown.
Yes, he was, by the way, a president of the West Seattle Land and Improvement Company. He originally is from Atherton, California, and he came up here to run the West Seattle Land and Improvement Company and was the president, and he was also in charge of the West Seattle Ferry.
Yes, that's right.
That's right. Now,
Go ahead.
if the original plat that you have is in the originally printed Lander, it says Lander, or is it crossed out and says?
No, I think something else is crossed out and Lander's written in.
Right,
the same with
Lander,
37th and Belvedere.
Right, because the street Lander did not come in existence as a name until after October of 1907.
Okay, well this, okay, well I will get a copy of this.
Rachel, where's Rachel? There's the person you need to talk about.
Just really quickly, on Alki Point, we could be called Roberts Point or Battery Point if it wasn't for something that happened over a period of time. So originally, this point was identified as Roberts Point, and the people that the U.S. Coast Survey came in and they were surveying all of Puget Sound in the 1850s, and they had just been up to the San Juan Islands and surveyed Point Roberts, and they came across Roberts Point and they said this wouldn't work, this might be confusing. So then they changed it to Battery Point, and I think they changed it to Battery Point because of the hill, you know, this hill that's there, because if you look at it from a certain angle, and it has been altered slightly, it's like a battery, you know, a defensive battery for someone coming, and so they just kind of arbitrarily looked at that and said, that's interesting, let's call it Battery Point. But even almost at the time that they named it that, everyone was still calling this Alki. And even when Maynard was here in the late 1850s and early 1860s, he called the farm Alki Farm. That was after everything had dispersed. And I think all the locals were calling it Alki, but the bureaucrats back in Washington, D.C. called it Battery until like the 1880s or 1890s.
1899.
It was 1890s, yeah, and then they finally realized, oh, the locals are calling it this, so we better change the name. So anyway, so that's, I like the way it ended up.
Yeah.
All right, did you have some handouts?
Yeah, I do. If anybody's interested in reading this underlying research paper, here we go. And anything else that happens to strike you as being important and worthwhile. You want to just pass them around? If there's more needed, I got more. Who would like to have?
Hey, that's all right.
Thank you.